Untitled Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barley.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barley. He's our storyteller, author of historical materials, and he continues to explore British Columbia.
Yep.
We're not going to a place today. We're going along a route. Tell me about this route.
Well, Mike, we're going along the old Dewdney Trail, which we've alluded to very briefly in other programs. The Americans called it the All-Red Route, which meant the British route through southern British Columbia. And it really was constructed between 1860 and 1865, those 5 years. And the two governors behind it, Governor James Douglas and Governor Seymour, Governor James Douglas in the 1860 era, and Governor Seymour, 1864, 1865. Two great trailblazers, Edgar Dewdney, after whom the trail is named, and another his partner called Walter Moberly. And, you know, the reasons for constructing the trail originally are really quite sound. First of all, there were many placer gold discoveries in British Columbia in the 1860s, and some of these were in the southern part of the province. One was at Rock Creek, and a big rush out of Rock Creek in late 1850s, and the other one, 1863, was in the Wild Horse. So they felt, okay, we have to construct this trail because all this, first of all, the trade was flowing south into the United States, into places like Dalles and so on. And so the trade was flowing south, and with the trade went the gold. And there was another thing they were worried about, and I think they were justifiably worried. They were worried that there were so many American miners in the southern part of British Columbia, they would clamor for this area to be annexed by the United States. And so Douglas, initial trail, he said, we will have to forestall that. We'll have to put a trail right through from the upper Fraser Valley right through into the interior of British Columbia and end at Rock Creek. But that was only half the trail. So that first section was completed, and then eventually from Rock Creek all the way through to the Wild Horse, which is another almost 300 miles, Mike.
Right. Now, this is more than just a path. This was an actual engineered, built facility, and we're going to take a look at it and talk about just the sheer enormity of this kind of a construction project when we come back from the break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're talking about the Dewdney Trail, named after one of its builders. And this was more than just a rut on the hillside, wasn't it?
Oh, sure, Mike. The first part of the Dewdney Trail was really the Engineers Road, and that went out from Hope, 1860, out for 20-odd miles. Then they stopped, and Dewdney was with them, so it's rightfully still called the Dewdney Trail. And then he went back, and finally Governor Douglas decided to put him under contract, and that's when he formed a partnership with Moberly. And then they began to drive that Dewdney Trail up over those Cascades, and it really quite a remarkable route. And I think a person has to understand, Mike, that in this area there were a number of other trails that already went through there. And, you know, certainly the Brigade Trail was prior to the Dewdney Trail, and then you had the Ghost Trail, and you had Black Eyes Trail, and you had all sorts of Indian trails and traders' routes through that country. But they had to develop a new system, a new trail that was 4 feet wide, Mike, had to be 4 feet wide, minimum of 4 feet wide, and there had to be a gradient of not more than 1 in 12, that is 1 foot in 12, which is about 8.5%, which is still fairly steep, but they couldn't go above that or beyond that. So these were the directions they were given, and they start this long, tortuous, carving out, some places an absolutely solid rock, as we could witness in that former picture, that very difficult road building. And it was quite a monumental task, really a monumental task.
And who was doing the building? I mean, this is before obviously before all power, so this had to be scraped out of the ground.
Oh, sure. They used horse and scraper. And the other thing they used was a mixed crew at first, as usual. And in many cases in British Columbia, when they couldn't rely on their crews, they left for gold rushes here and there, you know, in the Tulameen and in the Similkameen, so they fell back on the Chinese. And the Chinese essentially did, I think, most of the bull work on the Dewdney Trail, certainly in the second section and part of the first section.
Now, that first section between what is now Hope and, I guess, the Similkameen Valley, how tough was that in comparison to...
Well, it wasn't the toughest part of the entire route, but it was very difficult. very difficult section. They went up to that Punch Bowl area, you know, which is noted in the Hudson's Bay journals and so on. And that's high alpine country. And very, very fascinating country, beautiful country. And the interesting thing, Mike, is this, is that that route, which, and it's kind of coincidental, when you take the whole Dewdney Trail right from Fort Hope right to the Wild Horse, and it more or less paralleled the 49th parallel, more or less. Here and there were jogs in it naturally, but it passed by 5 massive mineral deposits. And one of the first deposits it passed by was Copper Mountain. Now,
which is Allenby, near Princeton, just south of Princeton?
Sure. The Dewdney Trail came within sight of Copper Mountain, and they looked across, and there they saw this stained rock, and of course a guy called Jameson discovered that. He was a half-blood, and eventually he turned it over to volcanic brown named Moyet, and they staked a massive discovery.
And it's Samilco mines to this day.
Sure,
I mean, it's still producing copper and gold.
Still producing copper and gold over 100 years later. So this is really quite remarkable.
Now, this is kind of remarkable, isn't it? This is a road built for the prospectors to walk to the gold trails, and it walks them right past the riches.
Yeah.
So that's Copper Mountain.
That's Copper Mountain. That's the first one.
Yeah.
And we're going to come across a number of others, Mike. So as we go down, and they go into Princeton or Vermilion Forks, and then you branch and you turn kind of southeast down into that lovely Similkameen Valley. Easy trail making there, very easy trail making.
Maybe it was just a groove in the ground there. I mean, they didn't have to do much building. It was a nice walk.
Oh, sure. Very easy. That's quick trail making. They could make 10 miles, 15 miles a day there. That pays for a lot of ground. And then they went by 20 Mile Canyon, and 20 Mile Canyon or 20 Mile Creek is now known as Hedley Creek, and there up on the side hill was another, eventually, this was years later, but the 1890s, they make a massive discovery there, and that's the Hedley Mascot and the Nickel Plate and all those storied mines of the past in the Hedley area. But these miners, who eventually followed that route between 1860-odd, right through to the 1890s, really didn't stop at those lode deposits, Mike, because most of them were placer men. They were looking for poor man's diggings, okay? That is placer diggings, shallow diggings, easy gold, gold in your hand. So as they come down that valley, they turn at Karamias, which was an old Indian camping ground, actually, and they turn south, almost due towards the American line. And they go through that very, very fascinating desert country down in that area and come by places like the old Utica mine. And then they stop just before a mountain pass. And this mountain pass is now called the Richter Pass. And the old-timers call it the Chinese Trail, which is kind of interesting. And now a lot of interest in this particular area. And I'll tell you why, Mike. If you reach over and just take that coin.
This is gold coin.
That's a gold half sovereign. And that's kind of interesting, Mike, and I'll tell you why. Because I've alluded to this very briefly several years ago, or some years ago in the program, but in that particular area, between the Kohler Ranch and what we call the Rendezvous Place, which is just down by the river, there were a number of camps down there, and the Dewdney Trail came through this area. And very unusual, but they picked up 3 or 4 or 5 gold sovereigns, not double eagles, not eagles, all English coins, sovereigns and half sovereigns in this particular area. I have some
I mean,
widely separated, sometimes several hundred yards apart.
Sort of just scattered around.
Sure. An American picked up some just right on the ground. Another orchard worker picked up another one, sitting right in the orchard, dug it up while he was tending to the trees. So, but we don't know the whole story behind it, except they are sovereigns, dated in the 1860s.
And because it was a rendezvous, I can't believe it was a guy who just went out and dropped them out of his pocket somewhere. It's a strange thing.
Unexplained, total mystery. Total mystery.
There we are. That's at the southern eastern end of the Similkameen Valley.
Now we're starting to head into the Okanagan. We go up that marvelous Richter Pass, and here you have a photograph recently taken, and it's hardly changed, Mike. The Okanagan Range beyond it, and you can see that desert country over there, and that's just about how it looked in the 1860s.
They pass Spotted Lake, too?
Oh, sure. We go right down the other side of Richter, past Klilik, or Spotted Lake, as is well known, and the Indians called that, they thought that had healing powers, so they stopped here to see if they could heal some of their ills, and indeed they did, and they're still considered semi-sacred by the Indians. And then they went down into the Okanagan, down into the desert country again, in that south country, right near Osoyoos, went across that spit of land, up Anarchist, and started to go down the other side through Bridesville, and Bridesville in that area, you know, that's a very, very beautiful part of the province, and then they went right down, and this was their goal, they went right down to Rock Creek itself.
Because this was the Rock Creek gold find of about 1860?
1858, 1859, yeah.
So this road was essentially the superhighway, or the transportation route that was supposed to, A, supply British control, B, be the route for commerce instead
Sure.
of it going down to the States, coming
That's right.
out to the west, and to supply some law and order, keep the British influence.
Yeah, there was a Rock Creek rebellion there, and Douglas never forgot that. So he wanted a route in there to keep these guys, to let them know that they were under English law or British jurisdiction. So there's where the first part of the story ends, because when they arrive at Rock Creek in 1861, 1858 was a high year, 1859 was a good year, 1860 was pretty good, but 1861 wasn't very good, Mike. So Douglas says, stop right there, go no farther, Rock Creek is in the decline, which it was. The 1,000 miners or 1,200 miners that had been on Rock Creek, now there are only a couple of hundred left. So the threat has disappeared.
And not only that, but the money to be made from commerce has disappeared.
Sure it has.
This darn route arrived a day late,
That's
and
right.
there's no dollars left.
Yeah, the raison d'etre is gone.
But that's not the end of it, and
No.
we're going to continue with that. When we come back from this break, we'll talk more about the continuation of the Dewdney Trail. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Believe it or not, it's 1861. The Dewdney Trail has finally reached Rock Creek, but the rush is over and there's no need to build. What turned it around?
Well, Mike, what turned it around was the finding of Studhorse Creek. Now,
Studhorse
yeah,
Creek.
Well, Studhorse Creek, they changed that to a more acceptable name, Wild Horse Creek, which is deep in the East Kootenays, beyond Cranbrook, beyond Old Fort Steele. And it was discovered in 1863 by a band of American miners who came up from the Inland Empire.
This is a traditional way riches are discovered in British Columbia.
Oh, for sure.
Because that was the route of transportation from south to north.
That's right. They were looking for Finlay's Creek, didn't make Finlay's Creek, branched off, tested this magnificent creek coming out of the Rockies, and found gold that would absolutely staggering amounts. And this soon resulted in the same thing that happened at Rock Creek. Miners began, trading with the South. Those trails went north and south rather than east and west, and the gold began drifting south, too. So now there's a new governor, Governor James Seymour, and Seymour says, we better continue the Dewdney Trail. So he only hires Dewdney this time. Dewdney comes back with his crew, picks up a bunch of Chinese again, and they began to go down from Rock Creek, down that Kettle River, down through that Kettle River country, and the first part is quite easy going. And so then they branch up in a little creek called American Creek, which is now called Boundary Creek. And you'll see one picture of there's the old Dewdney Trail still in this particular shot. And the Dewdney Trail is between the old railroad track above and the modern highway today, Mike. And that's interesting. And then they went by, crossed over a little creek called Boundary Creek, and right close to that crossing place was the old smelter. And the old smelter was this is what we call the Sunset Smelter. And then they branched up over a little creek called McCarran Creek and went up into the hills. And this is very unusual because they went up in the hills, and that Dewdney Trail cut around close to what they call Dead Man's Hill, and then down the other side. But when it went up there, it passed another stained outcrop of rock. Now, at this particular time, those miners went right on by, all through the 1860s.
Placer, right?
They were looking for placer, and they found placer in the area, on Boundary Creek, on Rock Creek, on Pass Creek, on 4th of July Creek, on all those little creeks in there, a fair amount. And they walked right by. But in the 1880s, late 1880s, two American prospectors came in there, Matt Hodder and Henry White, and they noticed this. They thought they'd stake it. They staked it, sold it out for a song, and, of course, this was I think, one of the most storied camps in the Old West. Certainly the classic ghost town, or one of the classic ghost towns of the Pacific Slope. And what happened there, of course, the town came into being.
What town?
And the town was very interesting. It's almost prophetic, Mike. The name of the town was Phoenix. And Phoenix, of course, was a copper gold camp, and they shipped out almost $100 million worth of copper gold out of this.
$100 million in those terms, in those years?
Over 60 million then, and well over that after when they came back. And in those first years, they established a city that is really almost unequaled. Bona fide city, and had several thousand people. And here is a photograph of the city as it looks at its height.
This is just a section of it.
Around 1908 or 1909, there were about 300 to 400 buildings in this city. We'll probably only see 75 here. So this is probably about a fifth of the city of Phoenix at that particular time.
And it was known as the highest city in the land, was it not?
Yeah, it was called the highest city in Canada, and at that particular time, prior to Calgary, it was between the 4,000 and 5,000 foot level.
But when we think back to the 1863 period, 1861-62, the road went right through it.
Sure did.
And nobody paid any attention.
And now, of course, this town that stood like that, intact for almost 20 years, Mike, has completely vanished. I call it the vanished city. There's nothing left, just a big hole in the ground. There are some artifacts. Here's one of them. And this is kind of interesting. That's the old jail lock with a cover plate from the original jail in Phoenix. And that was in Grand Forks originally, and it's really quite a magnificent piece.
And to find anything, from a town that had its very foundations excavated in the search of gold and copper is amazing.
And that gives you a comparison of the average lock. That would be just a miner's lock, but this would be a jail lock. And this is kind of an interesting piece too, Mike. That's a silver, sterling silver parasol handle, which one of the ladies of questionable reputation held in the parasol itself is gone, of course.
It would make quite a nice cudgel, too. I mean, that would strike you a smart one on the bridge of the nose.
Oh, yeah. And so what happened, of course, is Phoenix eventually comes to life after the Dewdney Trail goes through. But at that particular time, they weren't interested in hard rock, so they went right down that Grand Forks Valley, right down the Kettle River, and thought they had to cross the Kettle River. They didn't. They headed towards the mouth of Christina Lake, crossed over Christina Creek, and then went up the most difficult part of the entire Dewdney Trail.
This is still living up to the contract, making this road 4 feet wide in order to accommodate miners walking and their horses.
And their horses, that's right. So they go up that Santa Rosa Summit. And the Santa Rosa Summit, I remember traveling that as a kid because one of the old roads from Rossland went over from there to Cascade. Some people call this the Cascades. It's really the Gold Range, okay? Cascades, of course, we've just gone through. So when you go up there, and that's kind of interesting because there are bits of that area that are quite intriguing. And there's even spots on the Santa Rosa. You can go down and you can actually get small quartz veins with free gold in them, but they don't add to any width, so it doesn't really add up.
You mean right now, walking through that area, you'd be able to encounter that?
Yeah, and we used to go up that switchback, about 16 switchbacks up towards the old Valbot mine, which is just outside of Rossland.
Yeah.
And then when you went right into Rossland, of course, that original Dewdney Trail in 1860 went right by Rossland.
Another golden city sprang up from the
golden city of the Old West.
On the margin of...
There are the mines, the War Eagle, the Center Star, and the Josie, and the Nickel Plate.
But they weren't looking for that gold. They were heading to Wild Horse.
That's right, they were. So they went down past the old city of Trail, came down to an old remains of a Hudson's Bay fort, which was called Fort Shepherd, and there they found a ford across the Columbia River. And that's a very difficult ford to find because that whole Columbia is an extremely treacherous river. You had to swim your horse across. Tough ford, a lot of people wouldn't take it. A lot of people wouldn't take it. Some did. Went across that river, up through the Salmo area, down the Salmo River, and then up a little creek called Lost Creek, which we now call the Skyway. There's a modern highway up there, Mike, over the Skyway into Creston, down through Creston, past Yak, past Kitchener, and then they made another discovery, Mike. Really quite astonishing. This is the 5th discovery. Came by a little lake called Moyet Lake, which is now known as Moyet Lake, unnamed then, and they discovered, they went right through what they considered just an ordinary area, but it was a rocky area, and what they actually discovered there later on, again in the 1890s, was the famous St. Eugene mine, and the town of Moyet was established. And the St. Eugene, discovered by an Indian, became one of the, in fact, for a given period of time, Mike, it was the richest silver mine in the province of British Columbia. So again, this trail was almost right on. If it had gone the other side of the lake, it would have passed it. But it went right on it. The Indians traveled that trail, and that's probably why Indian Peter found it. And so Moyet became one of the great mining towns of the East Kootenay, and the St. Eugene mine, one of the great mines of British Columbia. And then they went beyond the Moyet into Cranbrook, and it starts to level out there, and then down over that nice, gently rolling country down there.
Making headway again.
Oh, sure. And then they come down, actually right into the edge of the Kootenay River, and there's Galbraith's Ferry. And Galbraith's Ferry was operated by a guy called Galbraith, obviously. They went across Galbraith's Ferry, and now they're not too far from Wild Horse. But Galbraith's Ferry eventually became Fort Steele. When the Mounted Police came in there some years later, about 1888, it became Fort Steele. And so they go past Galbraith's Ferry, and they start climbing up. And here's a very interesting shot, Mike, of how they climbed up the top. And this is the trail as it looks in about 1865, or perhaps just a little later. And that's the trail itself, just outside of Wild Horse.
And that shows you, again, the construction technique. It had to be, it was not just a rut in the ground. No. It was an actual engineered road.
Sure. Oh, yeah, no doubt about it.
So how far are they from Wild Horse? Here they are. I'm just thinking to myself, the rush is on at Wild Horse, and the engineers want to get there in order to make the transportation route.
It's now 1865, Mike. Very interesting and very crucial, really.
Yes.
What has happened? They've mined all through 1863. They've gone right into 1864. And we don't know. The estimates vary from the Wild Horse anywhere from $9 million to $30 million in gold, which is absolutely staggering. Nuggets up to 3 pounds. And they get into the Wild Horse, and the rush essentially is over. It is really over. And their timing is poor because these placer rushes, both governors didn't realize, not many placer rushes last beyond 3 or 4 years. Now, they did in Atlan, and they did in the Caribou, and certainly in the Klondike. But in most other areas of the province, it was a 2 or 3 year span, and then the rush was off. And that's what happened. But, you know, it's kind of interesting because it didn't spell the end of the Wild Horse. Because what happened is the Chinese crew were paid off, and they were paid off completely by
now, what are we talking about, crew here? How many Chinese worked on the Dewdney Trail?
It varied. It varied with how many he lost along the route, but probably around 60 to 80. And sometimes less than that, sometimes more than that. So, or fewer, I should say. And, but by the time they get to the Wild Horse, there are probably 75 Chinese hired on that crew, and they stay. They can realize the potential of the Wild Horse. They do extremely well. They settle on the Wild Horse, stay there from the 1860s, Mike, right through to the turn of the century, some of them, till they're old men and go back to China as relatively wealthy Chinese. And they became, of course, absolute expert hydraulic miners. Yeah. And they were able to work those cliffs. And, of course, Dewdney himself realizes his prize. His prize is $74,000.
That's what his contract is for building this.
Yeah. Tendered all his bills, paid for promptly. He goes on to greater glory and eventually, of course, becomes lieutenant governor of the western provinces, that is the prairie section, and he was eventually the individual who signed the death warrant of Louis Riel.
This is the Dewdney after whom the Dewdney Trail is
Sure,
named.
this is the famous
That's a component of
Dewdney.
his life I was unaware of.
Oh, yeah, he's quite an interesting guy, and a guy who really was unusual man, a man of action, sometimes rough around the edges.
Well, to build a trail through wilderness,
Sure.
Mind you, he didn't get it done on time, but that doesn't demean the fact that the trail was there, past all of these other spots where riches were going to crop up down the road.
And, you know, you could still see that trail, Mike, here and there. When I was a kid, my father said, if you ever get lost up near Santa Rosa or up near the Velvet, he said, go to the Dewdney Trail. He said, travel east, and you'll be fine. And
to this day, can we step out our door in the South Okanagan or southern British Columbia and walk the Dewdney Trail?
There are parts you can walk, but probably not much. I think you can still trace that Dewdney Trail for around 60% of its entire length, Mike. That's about all. And there are parts that are extremely well marked because of the thousands and thousands of horses and men that walked along that trail. It's still packed down a century and a third later. In fact, just over a century and a third later.
The Dewdney Trail. Well, who said you had to be on time for these gold rushes and things? Not necessarily. A fascinating story that starts in 1860 and concludes in 1863, but it's still on location to this day, the Dewdney Trail. We'll see you next time on Gold Trails.